What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, there's a world record that will probably never be broken? Not by any human serial killer, not by any modern predator, not by anything walking this planet today, and that record is held by a single female tiger who systematically hunted and killed over 436 human beings across 2 countries over 8 years, making her the deadliest individual animal in recorded history. And the most terrifying part is that she didn't kill randomly or out of starvation. She specifically chose humans as her preferred prey, ignoring the abundant wildlife around her to focus exclusively on hunting men, women, and children with a calculated precision that made entire regions of Nepal and India become ghost towns as people literally abandoned their homes rather than risk becoming victim number 437. This is not mythology. This is not exaggerated folklore passed down through generations. This is the documented, verified, and absolutely bone-chilling true story of the Champawat tigress. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why this particular tiger is considered the most prolific man-eater that has ever existed. Why her reign of terror lasted almost a decade, despite the best efforts of the British colonial government and local hunters, and why it took one specific legendary hunter named Jim Corbett to finally end what had become the most horrific human-wildlife conflict ever recorded in history. The year was 1898, when this nightmare began in the remote Rupal district of Nepal, where a Bengal tigress, for reasons that would later become tragically clear, made the decision that would transform her from a normal wild predator into something that defied everything wildlife experts thought they understood about tiger behavior, a decision that would result in the highest confirmed body count of any single animal attacking humans, surpassing every other man-eating tiger. Every lion, every leopard, every predator in documented history by such a massive margin that the numbers still seem impossible to comprehend, even when you're looking at the official records. This was not a starving animal desperately taking whatever prey it could find. This was not a wounded tiger unable to hunt its normal prey. This was not even a confused animal that had lost its natural fear of humans through habituation. This was something far more sinister and far more calculated, a predator that had somehow learned that humans were not the dangerous, tool-using species that tigers normally avoid, but were instead slow, vulnerable, relatively defenseless prey that could be taken with minimal risk and maximum efficiency. And once she learned this lesson, she applied it with a methodical consistency that turned her into the most efficient killing machine targeting humans that the world has ever seen. The first attacks in Nepal were initially dismissed as isolated incidents, the kind of unfortunate encounters that occasionally happen when humans and predators share territory. But as the body count began climbing from 10 to 20 to 50 to over 100 victims, it became horrifyingly clear that this was not a series of random attacks, but a sustained campaign of predation by a single individual who had decided that human flesh was her food source of choice. Villages throughout the Rupal district began living in absolute terror as the tigress moved through the region like a ghost, striking at dawn, at dusk, in broad daylight, at night, seemingly without pattern or predictability, taking victims from fields where they were working, from paths where they were walking, from the edges of villages where they thought they were safe, and each attack added to the growing legend of an unstoppable predator that had turned the natural order completely upside down. The Nepalese government mobilized hunting parties, deployed soldiers, offered rewards, and organized massive drives to try to kill or capture the tigress. But she evaded every attempt with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural, learning to recognize the signs of organized hunts, avoiding areas where armed men were present, and simply moving to new hunting grounds where unsuspecting victims had no idea they were about to become part of history's most horrific wildlife statistics. After killing an estimated 200 people in Nepal alone, enough victims that entire villages had been depopulated and vast regions of formerly inhabited land had been abandoned to the jungle, the tigress did something that would make the situation exponentially worse. She crossed the border into India, specifically into the Kumaon district, bringing her reign of terror to British colonial territory and creating an international crisis that would draw attention from around the world as newspapers began reporting on the demon tigress that had already killed more people than any predator in recorded history and showed no signs of stopping. The British colonial authorities in India were initially skeptical of the reports coming from Nepal, thinking the numbers must be exaggerated or that multiple tigers were being blamed on a single animal. But as the attacks continued in India with the same methodical efficiency, as the body count climbed past 250, then 300, then kept climbing week after week, month after month, year after year, they realized with growing horror that the reports were not exaggerated at all. If anything, they might be undercounted because many attacks in remote areas were probably never officially recorded, meaning the true number of victims might be even higher than the already staggering official count. The psychological impact on the population was devastating and unprecedented, as entire communities lived under a shadow of terror that modern people in developed countries can barely comprehend, where stepping outside your home meant accepting the risk that you might be dragged screaming into the jungle by a predator that had killed hundreds of people before you and would kill hundreds more after you unless someone could stop her. Children stopped going to school, farmers abandoned their fields, travelers refused to use certain roads, and the local economy began collapsing as normal life became impossible under the constant threat of a predator that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, that could strike anyone at any time and had proven that no precaution was sufficient to guarantee safety. The British government, facing mounting pressure from terrified communities and international attention that was making the colonial administration look incompetent and powerless, deployed the army, mobilized local hunters, offered enormous bounties, and threw every resource they had at the problem. But the tigress continued to evade capture and continued to kill with a regularity that suggested she was not just surviving, but thriving on human prey, having completely adapted to a lifestyle where humans were her primary food source, and she had refined her techniques to the point where taking human victims required less energy and involved less risk than hunting the wild boar, deer, and other natural prey that other tigers relied on. Expert hunters from across India were brought in to track and kill her, men with decades of experience hunting tigers and intimate knowledge of how these predators think and operate. But the Champawat tigress outwitted them all, learning to recognize the signs of a planned hunt, avoiding baits and traps, changing her patterns to stay unpredictable, and generally demonstrating a level of intelligence and adaptability that went far beyond normal animal behavior and suggested something approaching strategic thinking, as if she understood that she was being hunted and was actively taking measures to avoid her pursuers while continuing to efficiently kill human victims. By the time her body count reached 400 confirmed victims, she had become more than just a man-eating tiger. She had become a legend, a nightmare made flesh, a demon that some people genuinely believed was supernatural or possessed by evil spirits, because how else could a single animal kill so many people over so many years while evading every attempt to stop her? How else could she seem to know when hunters were waiting for her? How else could she continue to operate successfully in areas where soldiers and armed civilians were actively patrolling and searching for her? The attacks followed certain patterns that wildlife experts and hunters began to recognize. She preferred attacking during daylight hours in the late afternoon when people were returning from fields or traveling between villages. She typically killed quickly and efficiently with a throat bite rather than the prolonged struggles that inexperienced predators often have with human prey, and she usually consumed at least part of her victim on sight before disappearing back into the dense forest, behavior that suggested she was completely comfortable with humans as prey and felt no need to hide or rush while feeding. the kind of confidence that comes from hundreds of successful kills and no meaningful consequences. Survivors who witnessed attacks or encountered the tigress described a large female with distinctive markings, missing some teeth from an old injury that researchers later theorized might have been the original trigger that pushed her toward easier human prey, though by the time this was discovered, she had long since perfected human hunting and would likely have continued even if her teeth had been intact, because she had learned that humans were simply easier to catch and kill than wild animals that could run faster, fight harder, and were more alert to danger. The missing teeth theory provided some explanation for how this nightmare began, but it did nothing to make the situation less terrifying for the thousands of people living in constant fear, knowing that a predator with over 400 kills to her name was still out there, still hunting, still adding to her record-breaking body count, while authorities seemed powerless to stop her despite years of effort and unlimited resources. Enter Jim Corbett, a name that would become legendary in India and around the world, a British-born hunter and tracker who had grown up in India and possessed an almost supernatural understanding of the jungle and its predators, a man who had already established a reputation for tracking and killing problem tigers and leopards that other hunters couldn't find, and who would now face the ultimate challenge of his career, stopping the most prolific man-eater in history, a tigress that had outwitted every previous attempt to kill her and had racked up a body count so high that it seemed impossible for a single animal to achieve. Corbett was initially reluctant to take on the hunt because he understood the magnitude of what he was facing. This was not a normal man-eater that had killed a few people and could be tracked using conventional methods. This was an animal that had been successfully evading hunters for 8 years, that had refined her techniques through hundreds of kills, that had demonstrated intelligence and adaptability far beyond normal tiger behavior, and that was operating in terrain that offered countless hiding places and escape routes, making the job of tracking and killing her extraordinarily difficult even for someone with Corbett's exceptional skills. But the desperate pleas from local communities, the continued mounting death toll, and the understanding that he might be the only person with the combination of skills, experience, and jungle knowledge necessary to stop this nightmare, convinced Corbett to accept the challenge, knowing that failure would mean more innocent people dragged screaming to their deaths by a predator that had already killed more humans than any animal in recorded history. The hunt that followed was not the dramatic, action-packed adventure that popular media often portrays, but a grueling, exhausting, psychologically draining pursuit that lasted weeks and pushed Corbett to the absolute limits of his physical and mental endurance, tracking a predator that was intimately familiar with every inch of the terrain, that had survived 8 years of concentrated efforts to kill her, and that possessed an uncanny ability to sense danger and disappear before armed hunters could get into position. Corbett began by studying the pattern of attacks, interviewing survivors and witnesses, examining kill sites, and building a profile of how the tigress operated, where she preferred to hunt, what time she was most active, and how she moved through the landscape, accumulating information that would allow him to predict her behavior and position himself for a possible encounter. He learned that she had adapted to human pursuit by becoming more cautious and unpredictable, no longer following set patterns, but varying her hunting grounds and techniques to avoid ambushes, demonstrating the kind of learning and adaptation that made her such an effective killer and such a difficult target for hunters who relied on predicting animal behavior. The local population was desperate for the nightmare to end, and everywhere Corbett went, he was met with stories of loss and trauma, people who had lost family members, children who had lost parents, entire families that had been destroyed by this single predator, and the weight of their expectations and their suffering added enormous psychological pressure to an already incredibly difficult and dangerous task. Corbett spent days tracking through dense jungle, following signs that most hunters would miss, reading the landscape with skills honed through decades of experience, slowly closing the distance to a predator that had proven she could outwit the best hunters in India and had survived countless organized drives and ambushes that should have killed her years ago. The psychological aspect of hunting the Champawat tigress was perhaps even more challenging than the physical demands, because Corbett understood that he was tracking an animal that had killed over 400 people, that knew she was being hunted, and that had demonstrated an intelligence and cunning that went beyond normal predator behavior, making every moment in the jungle a calculated risk where he might become victim number 437 if he made even a single mistake or underestimated his adversary. He set up positions near known travel routes, waited in ambush sites for hours or days, followed fresh tracks through difficult terrain, and gradually pieced together an understanding of how the tigress was moving through the area and where she might appear next, using every bit of his knowledge and experience to gain an advantage over a predator that had outsmarted everyone else who had tried to kill her. The final confrontation came in 1907 near the village of Champawat that would give the tigress her name in history books. When Corbett finally managed to position himself along a route the tigress was using and waited with the patience that separates successful hunters from those who fail, knowing that he might only get one shot and that missing would mean the hunt would continue indefinitely while more people died. When the tigress finally appeared, Corbett's shot was true, ending 8 years of terror with a single bullet that brought down the most prolific man-eater in recorded history, a predator that had killed an estimated 436 confirmed human victims and possibly many more that were never officially documented. A body count so staggering that it still seems impossible even when you're looking at the historical records and eyewitness accounts. The examination of the tigress's body revealed the missing canine teeth that researchers believe may have initially pushed her toward easier human prey, though by the end she was so skilled at hunting humans that the dental damage was probably irrelevant to her continued choice of prey. She had simply learned that humans were easier to kill than wild animals, and had refined her technique through hundreds of successful hunts until she had become the most efficient human-hunting predator that has ever existed. The death of the Champawat tigress brought overwhelming relief to communities that had lived in terror for 8 years, as people could finally resume normal activities without the constant fear that they might be the next victim. Children could return to school, farmers could work their fields, and life could slowly return to some semblance of normalcy in regions that had been paralyzed by fear for nearly a decade. Jim Corbett became a hero throughout the region, and his reputation as a hunter and tracker reached legendary status, though Corbett himself was deeply affected by the experience and the suffering he witnessed, leading him to later become one of India's first wildlife conservationists and advocates for tiger protection, understanding that man-eating behavior was aberrant and that tigers in general deserved protection rather than persecution. The body count of 436 confirmed victims represents just the officially documented kills, as researchers and historians believe the true number was probably higher because many attacks in remote areas were never reported or recorded, meaning the Champawat tigress may have actually killed closer to 500 people or more during her 8-year reign of terror, a number so staggering that it's difficult to comprehend and represents more human deaths than most serial killers achieve in their entire careers combined. The story of the Champawat tigress raises profound questions about what drives certain individual animals to become dedicated man-eaters, about how a predator that normally avoids humans can undergo such a dramatic behavioral transformation, and about what it means when an animal crosses the boundary from occasional opportunistic attacks to systematic, sustained predation on humans as a primary food source. Wildlife experts and behaviorists have studied the case extensively, trying to understand the factors that created history's deadliest man-eater, with most agreeing that the initial dental injury probably pushed her toward easier prey, but that her continued choice of humans even after she had developed compensatory killing techniques suggests she had learned that humans were simply the most efficient food source available, requiring less energy to catch and kill than wild prey that could run faster and fight more effectively. The psychological impact on the affected communities extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families, creating generational trauma in regions where grandparents still tell stories of the terror they lived through, where the Champawat tigress remains a powerful cultural memory, representing the ultimate nightmare of human vulnerability in the face of nature's most efficient predators. The case fundamentally changed how colonial authorities and wildlife managers approached man-eating incidents, establishing protocols and response strategies that are still used today when individual animals begin targeting humans, though thankfully nothing approaching the scale of the Champawat tigress has occurred since, making her record likely to stand forever as the deadliest individual animal attack on humans in documented history. Jim Corbett went on to hunt and kill several other notable man-eaters after the Champawat tigress, including the Pana leopard that killed over 400 people and several other tigers that had claimed dozens of victims, establishing himself as perhaps the most successful hunter of man-eating predators in history. But he later expressed deep regret about the necessity of killing these animals and became an advocate for tiger conservation, recognizing that man-eating behavior was aberrant and usually caused by human activities that damaged wildlife habitat or injured animals, making humans at least partially responsible for creating the conditions that produce man-eaters. The Champawat tigress remains a cautionary tale about human-wildlife conflict, about what happens when predators and people are forced into close proximity without adequate buffers or management, and about how individual animals can sometimes undergo behavioral transformations that turn them into threats of unprecedented magnitude, requiring responses that balance human safety with wildlife conservation in ways that are never simple or straightforward. The 436 confirmed victims of the Champawat tigress were individuals with names and families and communities that mourned them, people who were simply living their lives when they encountered a predator that had decided humans were prey, and their deaths represent not just statistics in wildlife management records, but human tragedies that affected thousands of people and shaped the history of entire regions in ways that are still felt over a century later. The legacy of the Champawat tigress extends far beyond the immediate tragedy of her victims, influencing wildlife policy throughout India and beyond, shaping how authorities respond to problem animals, informing research into predator behavior and what causes certain individuals to become man-eaters, and serving as the ultimate example of why human-wildlife conflict management must be taken seriously before situations spiral out of control and body counts reach levels that seem impossible to modern people living in developed countries where large predator attacks are virtually unknown. The story continues to fascinate researchers, wildlife managers, and the general public over a century after the tigress was killed, representing a unique case study in predator behavior, human vulnerability, and the complex dynamics that occur when humans and dangerous wildlife share the same space without adequate separation or management. Questions that become more relevant as human populations continue expanding into formerly wild areas and as climate change and habitat loss force wildlife into closer contact with human communities. The record of 436 kills stands as a grim reminder that nature is still wild despite our best efforts to control it, that predators are still predators regardless of conservation status, and that the boundary between human civilization and the natural world remains permeable and dangerous in ways that most modern people have forgotten. but that were brutally clear to the communities that lived through 8 years of terror at the hands, or rather the jaws, of history's deadliest man-eating predator, a single female Bengal tiger that killed more humans than any other individual animal in recorded history, and whose story continues to captivate and horrify everyone who learns about the Champawat tigress and her unprecedented reign of terror across Nepal and India.